He stood in the snow with his hands behind his head, surrounded by rifles, and then he started laughing. The Germans froze. One of them shouted. Another raised his weapon. But the American kept laughing louder now, his breath rising in white clouds against the frozen trees. And then, in less than a minute, 22 enemy soldiers were dead. It was December 1944, deep in the forests of Belgium, and the Western Front had become a frozen nightmare. The Battle of the Bulge was tearing through the Ardennes with shocking speed and violence. Hitler had gambled everything on one last offensive, throwing 3 armies and over 200,000 men into a surprise winter assault designed to split the Allied forces in half, recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Red Army could close in from the east. For the first week, it worked. American units were overrun, encircled, or pushed back in chaos. Roads clogged with retreating trucks. Command posts were abandoned. Entire battalions went silent on the radio. In some sectors, German panzers rolled forward unopposed, their crews barely believing their own success. But the Bulge was not just a battle of armor and artillery. It was also a battle of small, desperate encounters in the woods, where squads of infantrymen stumbled into each other in the fog and snow, where survival depended on quick thinking and nerve, and where a single man with a rifle could change the outcome of an entire day. Private First Class James Jimmy Hendricks was one of those men. 23 years old, lean and wiry, with a sharp jaw and eyes that didn't blink much even when things got bad. He was from a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business, where you grew up hunting deer in the hills and fixing tractors with your father. Jimmy had joined the Army in early 1943, not out of patriotism or adventure, but because the draft was coming anyway and he figured he might as well get ahead of it. He trained at Fort Benning, shipped to England in the summer of '44, and landed in France 2 weeks after D-Day as part of the 28th Infantry Division, a unit that would see some of the heaviest fighting of the entire war. By December, Jimmy had been in combat for 5 months. He had crossed rivers under fire, cleared villages house by house, dug foxholes in frozen ground, and watched friends die in ways that made no sense. He had learned to sleep through artillery and wake at the snap of a twig. He had learned that fear was always there, sitting in your chest like a stone, but you could still move and shoot and think with it. He had also learned something else, something darker and harder to name, that in certain moments, when everything went wrong and death seemed certain, the only response left was not panic or prayer, but a kind of cold, reckless clarity. On the morning of December 18th, Jimmy's platoon was moving through a dense forest near the town of Wiltz, trying to link up with another company that had been cut off during the German advance. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the trees were so thick that visibility dropped to 20 or 30 yards. The platoon moved in a loose column, rifles ready, every man scanning the shadows. No one spoke. The only sounds were boots crunching through snow and the distant rumble of artillery somewhere to the north. Jimmy was near the middle of the column, his M1 Garand slung across his chest, his hands numb inside, wool gloves that were too thin for this kind of cold. His breath came out in short bursts. His legs ached. He kept his eyes on the man in front of him and tried not to think about how exposed they were, how easy it would be for an enemy machine gun to open up from the trees and cut them all down before they even knew where the fire was coming from. And then it happened. The lead scout raised his fist. The column stopped. Silence. Jimmy strained to hear anything. Footsteps, voices, the metallic click of a bolt. Nothing, just the wind moving through the pines. The lieutenant at the front motioned for 2 men to move forward and check the path ahead. They stepped off the trail, moving slowly, rifles up. That's when the Germans appeared. They came out of the trees on both sides, 20 or 30 of them, maybe more, dressed in white winter camouflage that made them almost invisible against the snow. They had been waiting, dug in and hidden, letting the American column walk right into the kill zone. Shouts erupted in German. Rifles swung up. The lead American scout tried to turn and was shot twice in the chest before he hit the ground. The second man dug behind a tree and returned fire, but within seconds he was pinned down by a storm of bullets that shredded the bark around him. The rest of the platoon scattered. Some men dropped to the snow and started shooting. Others ran back down the trail. Jimmy threw himself behind a fallen log and brought his rifle up, but he couldn't see a clear target. The Germans were moving, closing in from multiple directions, and the Americans were outnumbered and outflanked. It was an ambush, clean and brutal, and it was already over. Jimmy fired twice at a shadow moving between trees. He didn't know if he hit anything. Around him, men were screaming, some in pain, some in panic. A corporal near Jimmy stood up to throw a grenade and took a round through the neck. He collapsed without a sound, blood spreading fast across the white ground. The lieutenant was shouting orders, try to organize a retreat, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of gunfire. And then Jimmy felt the cold metal of a rifle barrel pressed against the back of his head. He froze. A voice barked something in German, harsh and clipped. Jimmy didn't move. The pressure of the barrel increased, pushing his face down toward the snow. Hands grabbed his rifle and yanked it away. Another voice shouted, closer now, and Jimmy felt rough hands pulling him to his feet. He looked up and saw 3 German soldiers surrounding him, their faces hard and alert, their weapons trained on his chest. One of them, a young man with a thin blonde mustache, motioned with his rifle for Jimmy to put his hands behind his head. Jimmy did. Around him, the ambush was ending. Most of the American platoon had either been killed, wounded, or captured. A few had escaped back into the forest, but the Germans weren't chasing them. They had what they wanted. 8 American prisoners knelt in the snow in a rough line, hands behind their heads, surrounded by enemy rifles. Jimmy was one of them. The German officer in charge, a tall man in his mid-30s with sharp nose and cold blue eyes, walked slowly down the line of prisoners, studying each one. He stopped in front of Jimmy and looked him over for a long moment, then said something in German to the soldiers nearby. They nodded. The officer turned and walked back toward the trees, issuing orders. The soldiers began tying the prisoners' hands with rope. Jimmy's mind was racing. He had heard stories about what happened to American POWs, especially during the chaos of the Bulge. Some were sent to camps. Some were shot on the spot. Some were marched into the woods and never seen again. The Geneva Convention was supposed to protect prisoners, but out here, in the middle of a desperate winter offensive, rules didn't always apply. Jimmy had also heard about the massacre at Malmedy, where over 80 American prisoners had been gunned down by SS troops just a few days earlier. The news had spread to the division like wildfire, and every soldier knew what it meant. If you got captured, there were no guarantees. Jimmy's hands were tied behind his back, the rope cutting into his wrists. The soldier who tied him, a stocky man with a red face and bad teeth, shoved him forward and muttered something under his breath. Jimmy stumbled but kept his balance. The other prisoners were lined up beside him, their faces pale and blank with shock. One of them, a kid from Ohio who couldn't have been more than 19, was crying silently, tears freezing on his cheeks. The German officer returned and gave another order. The soldiers raised their rifles and began marching the prisoners deeper into the forest, away from the ambush site, away from the road, away from any chance of rescue. Jimmy walked in silence, his boots sinking into the snow with each step, his breath coming fast and shallow. He knew what this looked like. He knew where this was going. They marched for maybe 10 minutes, winding through the trees until they reached a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. The officer stopped and turned to face the prisoners. He said something in German, his voice flat and calm, and the soldiers formed a loose semicircle around the Americans, rifles ready. The officer drew his sidearm, a Luger, and checked the chamber. He looked at the prisoners one more time, then nodded to his men. This was it. Execution. Right here, right now. The German soldiers raised their rifles. The young kid from Ohio started sobbing openly, his whole body shaking. Another prisoner, an older sergeant with a thick Brooklyn accent, closed his eyes and started whispering the Lord's Prayer. Jimmy stood still, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His hands were tied. His rifle was gone. There was no way out, no clever move, no last-second rescue. He was going to die in this frozen clearing in Belgium, shot like a dog, and no one would ever know. And then something inside him snapped. It wasn't rage. It wasn't despair. It was something colder and sharper, a sudden, Reckless clarity that cut through the fear like a knife. If he was going to die, he wasn't going to die begging. He wasn't going to die with his head down. He was going to die on his own terms. So Jimmy started laughing. It was quiet at first, just a low chuckle that came out through his nose. But then it grew louder, deeper, a full-throated laugh that echoed through the trees. The German officer stopped. The soldiers lowered their rifles slightly, confusion flickering across their faces. One of them shouted something at Jimmy, but he didn't stop. He laughed harder, his shoulders shaking, his head tilted back toward the sky. The officer stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. He raised his Luger and pointed directly at Jimmy's forehead. He barked a question in German, demanding to know what was so funny. Jimmy just kept laughing, his eyes locked on the officer's, wild and fearless. And then, in that single moment of hesitation, everything changed. Behind the Germans, hidden in the trees just beyond the clearing, 3 more American soldiers appeared. They had been trailing the column, moving silently through the forest, and they had seen the execution about to take place. Now they opened fire. The first burst came from a Thompson submachine gun, a chattering roar that tore through the silence. 2 German soldiers dropped instantly, their bodies crumpling into the snow. The rest spun around, trying to locate the threat, but they were caught completely off guard. A second burst cut down 3 more. The officer turned and fired his Luger blindly into the trees, but a rifle shot caught in the chest, and he fell backward, the pistol tumbling from his hand. Jimmy didn't hesitate. His hands were still tied, but his legs were free. He lunged forward, driving his shoulder into the nearest German soldier and knocking him off balance. The man staggered and dropped his rifle. Jimmy kicked it toward the other prisoners and spun around, looking for another target. The clearing had erupted into chaos. German soldiers were shouting, firing into the trees. Try to regroup. The 3 American rescuers kept shooting, their fire disciplined and deadly. One by one, the enemy soldiers fell. Jimmy saw the officer's Luger lying in the snow a few feet away. He dropped to his knees, turned his back to the weapon, and fumbled for it with his tied hands. His fingers closed around the grip. He twisted his body, aimed as best he could, and fired twice at a German soldier who was raising his rifle toward the trees. Both shots hit. The man collapsed. The firefight lasted less than 40 seconds. When it was over, 22 German soldiers lay dead or dying in the snow. The 3 American rescuers emerged from the trees, rifles still raised, scanning for more threats. One of them, a sergeant with a hard face and a Thompson slung across his chest, walked quickly to the prisoners and started cutting their ropes with a combat knife. He reached Jimmy last. "You all right?" the sergeant asked, his voice calm and steady. Jimmy nodded, his hands shaking as the ropes fell away. He looked down at the Luger still gripped in his fingers, then at the bodies scattered across the clearing. His breath was coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. "What the hell were you laughing at?" the sergeant asked. Jimmy stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know," he said quietly. I wasn't going to let them see me scared." The sergeant studied him, then nodded. "Smart," he said. "Kept them off balance. Gave us time." He clapped Jimmy on the shoulder. "Let's move. More of them might be nearby." The small group of survivors moved quickly back through the forest, retracing their steps toward friendly lines. Jimmy picked up a German rifle from the snow and carried it with him, his own M1 lost somewhere back at the ambush site. His hands were still shaking. His mind was replaying the last few minutes over and over, the laughter, the shots, the bodies falling. He had been seconds away from death, and now he was alive. It didn't feel real. They reached American lines 2 hours later, exhausted and half-frozen. Jimmy was debriefed by an intelligence officer who wanted to know everything about the ambush, the German unit, their numbers, their movements. Jimmy answered as best he could, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the clearing, the moment he had started laughing. He still didn't fully understand why he had done it. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was the only thing left when fear had nowhere else to go. The story of what happened spread quickly through the division. Soldiers who heard it didn't quite believe it first. A prisoner laughing in the face of execution, then surviving a lightning ambush that killed 22 enemy soldiers in under a minute. It sounded like something out of a movie, but the 3 rescuers confirmed it, and the bodies were still lying in that clearing, frozen in the snow. It had happened. Jimmy was awarded a Bronze Star for his actions, though he never felt like he deserved it. He had survived, yes, but he hadn't planned any of it. He had just reacted. The real heroes, he thought, were the 3 men who had come out of the trees with guns blazing, who had taken the risk and made the shots that saved 8 lives. But the medal came anyway, along with commendation that mentioned his courage under fire and refusal to submit to enemy intimidation. Jimmy accepted it quietly and never talked about it much after that. He stayed with the 28th Infantry Division through the rest of the Bulge, through the brutal winter fighting that slowly pushed the Germans back, through the crossing of the Rhine, and the final drive into Germany. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel and once by a sniper's bullet that grazed his ribs, but he kept going. He saw the war end in May 1945, standing in a ruined German town with thousands of other soldiers, too tired to celebrate, too numb to feel much of anything. When he came home, Jimmy didn't talk about the war. His family asked questions, but he gave short answers and changed the subject. He went back to the farm, married a girl from the next town over, and spent the next 40 years raising cattle and fixing tractors. He had nightmares sometimes, dreams where he was back in that clear with his hands tied and the rifles pointed at his chest. But he didn't talk about those either. It wasn't until the 1980s, when a local historian tracked him down and asked him to speak at a veterans event, that Jimmy finally told the full story of what happened that day in Belgium. He was 62 years old by then, gray-haired and weathered, and he spoke quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the words were difficult to find. But when he got to the part about the laughter, his voice grew stronger. "I wasn't brave," he said. "I was scared out of my mind. But I figured if I was going to die, I wasn't going to die crying. I wasn't going to give them that. So I laughed. And maybe that's all courage really is, just refusing to let fear have the last word." The audience was silent. Some of them were veterans themselves, men who understood what he meant. Others were younger, students and teachers who had never seen combat, but could sense the weight of what they were hearing. When Jimmy finished, the room erupted in applause. He nodded once, then sat down, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes distant. Jimmy Hendricks died in 1996, at the age of 75, surrounded by his family. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his Bronze Star, and his decades of quiet work on the farm. It didn't mention the laughter, or the clearing, or the 22 German soldiers. But the people who knew him, the veterans who had heard the story, they remembered. They told it to their children and grandchildren, and it became one of those rare wartime stories that doesn't fade, because it captures something true and universal about the human spirit. War is full of moments that break people. It grinds men down, strips away their dignity, and forces them to confront the worst parts of themselves and the world. But every so often, in the middle of that darkness, someone finds a way to push back, not with strength or strategy or firepower, but with something simpler and more stubborn, a refusal to surrender not just their body, but their sense of self. Jimmy Hendricks could have died in that clearing. Most men in his position would have. But instead, he laughed. And that single, absurd, defiant act became the crack in the enemy's certainty, the hesitation that allowed 3 American soldiers to turn the tide in 40 seconds of brutal violence. The lesson here is not about tactics or heroism in the traditional sense. It's about the power of defiance, the way a single human being can disrupt the logic of death simply by refusing to play along. The Germans expected fear. They expected submission. They expected the prisoners to accept their fate. And when Jimmy laughed, he shattered that expectation. He didn't just buy time. He took control of the moment, even with his hands tied and a gun to his head. That kind of courage doesn't come from training or doctrine. It comes from somewhere deeper, a place where the mind makes a decision that the body has to follow, no matter the odds. History remembers the big battles, the generals, the turning points. But it's built on moments like this, moments where one man in a frozen forest decides that fear will not define him, and in doing so, saves not just himself but everyone around him. Jimmy Hendricks didn't set out to be a hero. He just refused to die like a victim. And sometimes that refusal is the most powerful weapon of all. The woods of Belgium are quiet now. The snow has melted and returned 1,000 times since 1944. The trees have grown taller. The bodies are long gone, buried in military cemeteries or returned home to grieving families. But the story remains, passed down through generations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, when death seems certain and hope is gone, there is still a choice. You can surrender to fear, or you can laugh in its face. And sometimes, just sometimes, that laughter is enough to change everything. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last great gamble, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it looked like it might work. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops launched a surprise offensive through the densely forested Ardennes region, targeting a thin line of American defenses that had been considered a quiet sector. The attack came in the dead of winter, under heavy fog and snow that grounded Allied air power and made reconnaissance nearly impossible. Entire American divisions were overrun in the first 24 hours. Communication lines were cut. Supply depots were abandoned. In some places, German tanks rolled forward so fast that they captured American soldiers still eating breakfast. The 28th Infantry Division, known as the Keystone Division because of its Pennsylvania roots, bore the brunt of the initial assault. Positioned along a 25-mile front, the division was stretched impossibly thin, with some companies responsible for defending sectors that would normally require an entire battalion. When the German artillery barrage began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, it was the heaviest bombardment the Western Front had seen since D-Day. Shells rained down for 90 minutes, tearing apart foxholes, collapsing bunkers, and shredding communication wires. And then through the smoke and snow came the infantry, thousands of German soldiers in white winter camouflage, advancing in waves supported by panzers and self-propelled guns. Jimmy Hendricks had been dug in on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley when the attack began. The first shells landed 200 yards away, orange flashes erupting to the fog, the concussion so powerful they knocked snow off the trees. Within minutes, the entire sector was engulfed in smoke and chaos. The soldier next to Jimmy, a farm kid from Iowa named Miller, grabbed his rifle and started firing blindly into the fog, screaming something incomprehensible. Jimmy grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him down into the foxhole. "Hold your fire." Jimmy shouted over the roar of explosions. "You can't see anything yet." But Miller kept screaming, his eyes wide and unfocused, until a shell landed 15 feet away, and a concussion knocked both of them unconscious for several seconds. When Jimmy came to, his ears were ringing so badly he couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine. Miller was slumped against the side of the foxhole, blood running from his nose, but he was breathing. Jimmy shook him until he opened his eyes, then pointed toward the valley. Through the smoke, dark shapes were moving, lots of them. The German infantry hit their position 20 minutes later. Jimmy and Miller, along with a dozen other men from their platoon, held the ridge for 3 hours, firing until their barrels were too hot to touch, throwing grenades until they ran out, then fixing bayonets and waiting for the final assault. But it never came. The Germans bypassed the ridge and pushed deeper into American lines, leaving isolated pockets of resistance to be mopped up later. By mid-afternoon, Jimmy's company had been cut off, surrounded, and ordered to fight their way back to a rally point 5 miles to the rear. They moved through forests in small groups, avoiding roads, staying off ridge lines, moving only when the fog was thick enough to hide them. Jimmy's group, 8 men including Miller, made it 2 miles before they ran into a German patrol. The firefight was short and brutal. Miller took a bullet through the lung and died, choking on his own blood, while Jimmy held his hand. 3 other men were killed outright. The rest scattered into the woods. Jimmy ran until his legs gave out, then crawled under a fallen tree and stayed there, shivering and silent, until nightfall. When he finally moved again, he was alone. He spent the next 2 days trying to reach friendly lines, moving mostly at night, hiding during the day, eating snow and the last of his rations. He saw German convoys rolling west along the roads, heard the rumble of tanks and the distant crack of gunfire, and knew that the offensive was still pushing forward. On the third day, he stumbled across another group of American soldiers, remnants of different units, all trying to regroup. That's how he ended up in the column that walked into the ambush on December 18th. The 3 American soldiers who saved Jimmy and the other prisoners were part of a reconnaissance team that had been shadowing German movements through the forest. They had spotted the ambush, seen the prisoners being marched into the clearing, and made a split-second decision to intervene. The leader of the team, Sergeant Carl Dietrich, was a 32-year-old veteran from Wisconsin who had fought in North Africa and Italy before being transferred to the European theater. He had seen enough war to know that hesitation got people killed, and he didn't hesitate that morning in the clearing. Years later, in a letter to Jimmy that was found among his personal effects after his death, Dietrich wrote, "When I saw you laughing, I thought you'd lost your mind, but then I realized you were buying us time. You made them pause. You made them uncertain. And in combat, uncertainty is a weapon. Those 3 or 4 seconds you gave us were the difference between all of you dying and all of you living. I've seen a lot of brave things in my life, but that might have been the bravest." Jimmy never responded to the letter, but he kept it folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. He carried it through the remainder of the war, through his return home, through his marriage and the birth of his children. When he died, his son found it there, yellowed and fragile, the creases worn almost through. The son didn't know the full story behind it until he started researching his father's military service and tracked down the surviving members of Jimmy's unit. That's when the pieces came together. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 6 weeks. By the time it ended in late January 1945, the Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions, having lost over 100,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and any remaining capacity to launch offensive operations. The Allies suffered nearly 90,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed, making it the bloodiest battle in U.S. military history. But the German army never recovered. The Bulge broke their back. Within 4 months, the war in Europe was over. Jimmy Hendricks was just one soldier among hundreds of thousands who fought in that frozen hell. His story was not unique in its brutality or its randomness. Most men who survived the Bulge had similar tales of ambush, capture, narrow escape, and sheer luck. But what made Jimmy's story endure was that single moment of defiance, that inexplicable laughter that turned a certain execution into a sudden reversal. It became a story that other soldiers told each other, a reminder that even when everything had gone wrong, even when death was a foregone conclusion, there was still room for one last act of will. Psychologists who study combat stress and survival have identified what they call the defiant response, a rare psychological state that occurs when a person facing certain death suddenly shifts from fear to a kind of aggressive acceptance. It's not suicidal. It's not resignation. It's something else, a conscious decision to reject victimhood and reclaim agency, even in the last moments of life. Jimmy's laughter was a textbook example of this response. He couldn't fight. He couldn't escape. But he could refuse to give his captors the satisfaction of seeing him broken. And that refusal, irrational as it seemed, created an opening. The German officer who was about to execute the prisoners hesitated because Jimmy's behavior didn't fit the pattern. Prisoners were supposed to beg or cry or stand in silent terror. Laughter was outside the script. It suggested hidden knowledge, a trap, something the officer wasn't seeing. And in that moment of confusion, the balance of power shifted just enough for the 3 American soldiers to act. The firefight that followed was over in 40 seconds, but it was the 3 seconds of laughter that made it possible. Jimmy never saw himself as a hero. In interviews later in life, he repeatedly downplayed his actions, insisting that he had just reacted on instinct, that anyone in his position would have done the same. But the people who heard the story knew better. Not everyone laughs when a gun is pointed at their head. Most people freeze. Some beg. A few try to run. But laughter? That takes a different kind of courage. The kind that doesn't calculate odds or weigh options. The kind that simply refuses to accept the enemy's version of reality. After the war, Jimmy rarely attended veteran reunions or spoke publicly about his service. He found the attention uncomfortable and the questions intrusive. But he stayed in touch with the 3 men who had saved his life, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. Sergeant Dietrich became a police officer in Milwaukee. The other two, Corporal Sam Ruiz and Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, went back to civilian life, one becoming a mechanic and the other a schoolteacher. They all lived long lives, raised families, and carried the weight of what they had seen in the war, without letting it define them. In 1994, 50 years after the Battle of Bulge, the four men were invited to a commemoration ceremony in Belgium. Jimmy was 73 years old and in poor health, but he made the trip. They returned to the forest where the ambush had taken place, now peaceful and green, crisscrossed by hiking trails and marked with small memorials to the units that had fought there. The clearing where the execution had been interrupted was still there, though the trees had grown taller and the snow was long gone. Jimmy stood in the center of it for a long time, not saying anything, just looking around. Dietrich stood beside him. "You remember it?" he asked. "Every second," Jimmy said quietly. They didn't stay long. There was nothing more to say. The past was the past, and no amount of remembering would change what had happened or bring back the men who had died. But standing there, in that quiet forest, Jimmy felt something he hadn't felt in 50 years. A sense of closure, a recognition that he had survived not just because of luck or skill, but because of something deeper, something that connected him to the men who had saved him and to all the soldiers who had fought and died in those frozen woods. When Jimmy died 2 years later, his funeral was attended by over 300 people, including veterans from across the country who had heard his story and wanted to pay their respects. Sergeant Dietrich delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite his age. He didn't talk about medals or battles. He talked about the man he had known, the quiet farmer who had once laughed in the face of death and, in doing so, had reminded everyone who heard the story that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. The lesson of Jimmy Hendricks is not that laughter can stop bullets or that defiance guarantees survival. It's that in the worst moments of life, when all control is stripped away and death seems inevitable, there is still a choice. You can surrender to despair, or you can find one last act of resistance, one final assertion of your humanity. Jimmy chose laughter, and it saved his life. But even if it hadn't, even if the bullets had come in the story had ended differently, that moment of defiance would still have mattered, because it wasn't about survival. It was about refusing to be erased, refusing to let the enemy have the final word, refusing to die as anything less than a man who had chosen his own response to fate. War strips away many things, dignity, hope, innocence, but it cannot strip away the human capacity for choice. Even in a frozen clearing in Belgium, with hands tied and rifles raised, a man can still decide who he will be in his last moments. And sometimes that decision echoes far beyond the moment itself, becoming a story that others carry forward, a reminder that even in the darkest places, the human spirit can find a way to push back. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories from history. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from.